Oh boy, here we go again. So, it's always fun talking about the Montreal Canadiens and going over the guys they acquired, talking about how they are either improving under their new team, like Kirby Dach, or if they're not doing all too well under their new team, like Evgeny Dadonov. But at the end of the day, these Montreal Canadiens acquisitions always give us something to talk about, especially when you consider what the future may hold for a lot of these players. The aforementioned Dach is probably going to be a household name for years to come. The aforementioned Dadonov is likely going to find himself a home elsewhere. But when it comes to the names that did not get sent over to Montreal, but were kind of in the running, this is where we open up an entirely new can of worms in our conversations. Let's head over onto the latest edition of the 32 Thoughts podcast and read, or I guess listen to, but we're not going to be listening to it. We're going to be going over onto an article that talks about it. Yeah, I'll leave a link in the description of multiple things. Firstly, it's the 32 Thoughts podcast audio, and secondly, it's an article on Montreal Hockey Now transcribing what it was that Friedman had to say. This is the article in question. The Canadiens had talks with the Philadelphia Flyers about a cap dump this summer, published by Marco D'Amico from 6 days ago. And if you read what exactly the article goes out there and talks about, it goes over a name on Philadelphia that actually is a point-per-game player at the moment. James Van Riemsdyk. This is JVR, a guy who has spent his career with Philadelphia. He went over to Toronto, and then he went back to Philadelphia. This season, the guy is at 13 points in 15 games played, on pace for 54 points, which would be his most productive season since his last year in Toronto in 2017-2018. He honestly used to be a really consistent, strong forward option that could pot up to 30 goals in a season. He did that twice with the Maple Leafs. It's just, in Philadelphia, things have not really gone his way as last season. I mean, the guy, sure, he had 24 goals, but 38 total points in 82 games played, was a minus 33, and has an AAV of $7 million. Now, the contract expires at the end of this current year. So, the Montreal Canadiens were one of the teams that the Philadelphia Flyers were apparently involved with when it came to trying to send JVR away in some sort of a one-year cap dump type of move. Let's head back over to the Montreal Hockey Now article and read what it has to say. The player the Flyers were trying to move was JVR, who had 1 year left on his contract worth $7 million a year. Earlier in the summer, the Flyers really wanted to move him out in order to sign Johnny Gaudreau, but unfortunately they could not move that salary to get that done. On a recent segment of the 32 Thoughts podcast, NHL insider Elliotte Friedman confirmed that JVR was shopped across the league with the goal odd dumping his entire salary. Please spell check your articles, Montreal Hockey Now, but the asking price was quite high. The asking price to take on all of JVR's contract from teams with available cap space like the Canadiens, the Coyotes, and the Ducks was Philadelphia's first. Granted, the Canadiens didn't have any cap space, but they did have an idea that Carey Price was not going to return and wanted to weaponize their newfound cap space through the use of LTIR. And so what this essentially means is that a lot of what these teams were asking Philadelphia for in order to take JVR on was Philly's 2023 first. They said, hey, okay, if you give us JVR, we also want your first, because we're doing you a solid, you gotta pay us back somehow. And we're not going to give you anything of value, like for JVR, $7 million. The guy had half a point a game last year, and he was a minus 33. Hell nah, bro. Like, we got to get something to make it worth our while. And that first-round pick from Philadelphia was apparently what the asking price was. At the time, the Canadiens wanted to add size and a key veteran presence into their lineup, and the acquisition of a player like JVR would have made a ton of sense. Montreal Hockey Now has had sources confirm to them that the Canadiens had conversations with the Flyers about JVR and were likely to be one of the teams asking for a first-round pick to take him on. And then the article goes over and talks about how Kent Hughes has talked about in the past how he wants to get a first-round pick, and the Flyers refuse to pay out that kind of price just to get rid of Van Riemsdyk, and the Habs inevitably moved on. Now today, JVR is indeed still with the Flyers, as we had talked about. He is doing pretty well, all things considered, on pace for 54 points in 62 games played. Of course, he missed out on a good chunk of this season so far, but they still got this guy and his $7 million AAV on the books. Meanwhile, for the Montreal Canadiens, it's good that Kent Hughes was able to say, okay, well, we have a price, we have our own market value for this type of a guy, and if you're not willing to pay it, then we're not going to make the deal. If you're not going to give us your first, Philadelphia, then we're not going to take on JVR. Simple as that. And for Kent Hughes, it's very nice because he ended up actually getting that first-round pick sometime later in the offseason when he acquired Sean Monahan. The same thing, sort of situation over there. The Calgary Flames, they needed to free up some cap space. They just lost Gaudreau, they just traded away Tkachuk, they just signed Jonathan Huberdeau, and then they were going after Nazem Kadri in free agency. In order to free up the money to get that done, they sent Monahan with a first-round pick over to the Canadiens. And we've talked about it a ton. This trade seems to be a pretty big win. The Canadiens have a legitimately good player in Monahan, and they have a potential trade chip in him if they find a team towards the trade deadline that is willing to take on Monahan and his services. Plus the fact that there's that first-round pick the Canadiens received on top of it. This is a win-win-win all around because the Canadiens, they get their draft pick. Sean Monahan gets his opportunity with another team if he gets traded at the deadline. And then you have yourselves the Calgary Flames that got the cap space to sign Kadri. It was a triple win, and the Philadelphia Flyers refused to do that sort of a process with JVR. Now, I'm not going to go out there and say that had JVR got sent over to Montreal, he would not have or actually have the same amount of success that he's got in Philadelphia this season, but it is just an interesting what could have been scenario here, because when you acknowledge what JVR was last year for the Philadelphia Flyers, he wasn't amazing. Like, sure, 20 goals is good. Like, anybody getting 20 goals in the NHL is a talented player, but for the dollar amount that he provides, it's certainly not enough, in my opinion, when you combine the rest of his play. JVR was never really noted as being the best all-round winger who could do everything, play extremely great defensive hockey, etc. He was no Esa Tikkanen, for crying out loud, but JVR was a goal scorer, a big dude who could plant himself in front of the net, who could make some nice snipes once in a while, but who was going to make his money because of the amount of goals that he puts in the twine. And for the Canadiens, I mean, I guess you could say they could use more of that, but any team could use more goal scorers, right? I'll just say right here that if you had asked me, hey, do you think the Canadiens would benefit more so from a guy like JVR, who will park himself in front of the net, maybe get 15 goals on the year, and maybe be on his way with 50% salary retained for maybe a second and a third, or a first if the Canadiens are lucky at the trade deadline? Or would you rather have Sean Monahan, who has a smaller cap hit, who has more of a redemption story behind him, and who had more to gain from this opportunity? I don't know, maybe it's the human emotion side of me that's talking here, but I feel like the Sean Monahan story is one that's so heartwarming to see that I would rather have had that than JVR in terms of what the Canadiens could have done to get their first-round draft pick in some sort of a weaponized cap space move. Sean Monahan was down in the dumps. The guy didn't even play as the Flames made it into their playoff run, etc. Monahan was there, he just wasn't used, and everybody kind of knew that it wasn't an inappropriate move to do so. It was just Monahan's overall play was so inconsistent and he was not the same player he had been that there wasn't a reason to go out there and justify trying to use him. But now, in Montreal, sure, he's injured at the moment, but the guy's on pace for 50 points if he finishes all 73 games available to him this season. So, Monahan, feel-good story, even if he re-signs in Montreal for a cheap cap hit. That's a good leader-type guy who was once at the top of the world when he was one of the younger players alongside of Gaudreau and Tkachuk, but eventually faded away because of so many injuries that he had to deal with. So, talk to the comments your thoughts about the idea of the Canadiens getting JVR in some sort of a trade and how it almost happened, how the Canadiens had those conversations with the Flyers to get JVR alongside of the Philadelphia first-round pick, wherein the Flyers ended up saying no. What are your thoughts on Sean Monahan and how the Canadiens got that first-round pick? Anyway, if you're a Flyers fan, what are your opinions on JVR still being on your team? What are your thoughts about not trading away your first in order to get rid of that contract? Do you regret this type of a move? Do you think the Flyers should have done it, sent JVR away alongside of your first-round pick to get some extra cap space for the year? I could understand if you really wanted to focus on winning today, winning in the now, and doing everything right here, because $7 million AAV is quite a lot of money, and if you wanted to sign Johnny Gaudreau, that would have been very helpful. But at the end of the day, I mean, you still got the guy, the money is freed up next year, so Who knows? Do you think that your decision is a little bit tainted now that you know that Johnny Gaudreau just ended up signing in Columbus? Like, he wouldn't have come to Philadelphia or New Jersey anyway, even if it was the amount of money that was given to him? Tell me in the comments your thoughts. I hope you enjoyed this video. Troll 9, and bye.